Jar Jar Binks is perhaps the most hated, or dare we say it, overhated character in Star Wars. In light of the absolutely vicious backlash the character received when the prequels were released, you'd think that Star Wars The Clone Wars would have avoided his character like the plague. Of course, you'd be wrong. Jar Jar appeared in quite a few arcs of the series, and in the arc we'll be talking about today, he wasn't all that bad either. The Disappeared, parts 1 and 2, were the 8th and 9th episode of season 6, and they did the supposedly impossible. They rehabilitated the character of Jar Jar Binks.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Before we begin, we highly encourage you to pause this video and actually re-watch the arc. Don't worry, we'll be waiting for you when you get back. If you've watched the arc just now, feel free to fast forward to the start of the next video chapter here on YouTube. If not, let's quickly recap what happened. At the height of the Clone Wars, the Republic receives a cry for help from neutral Bar-Dota, a remote, reclusive world with its own unique Force tradition. The Dagoyan Masters, religious monks with a high place in Bar-Dotan society, have been disappearing one by one, and the Bar-Dotans fear their vanishing is the harbinger of doom for their society. Their Queen Julia requests the Republic send aid, and specifically requests the help of Representative Jar Jar Binks. Binks, accompanied by Mace Windu, goes to Bar-Dota to help. It turns out that he and the Queen had met before, and that they actually had a relationship, to the astonishment of Master Windu. But before long, Julia disappears as well, as does Jar Jar. Windu sets out to find them, tracing their disappearances to the Fangirl cult. Windu rescues Jar Jar from the cult and tracks their movements to Zardosa Styx, where, at length, the unlikely pair rescue Queen Julia and confront the mastermind behind the disappearances, Mother Talzin. Windu and Talzin battle, and in the end, the Night Sister is vanquished, for the time being. According to one of the writers who worked on this arc, George Lucas actually commissioned this story with the express purpose of rehabilitating Jar Jar as a character. And you know what? It actually worked. Now, we're of the somewhat controversial opinion that Jar Jar was never all that bad in the first place. He was a bit annoying and overly silly in the prequels, sure, but we'd argue that most of the hatred directed toward him was just because he was an easy target for fans angry that The Phantom Menace wasn't just a re-release of A New Hope. But Jar Jar was nonetheless a much better character in The Disappeared than pretty much any other Star Wars story. Jar Jar's performance in The Disappeared is genuinely enjoyable. The reason why, we'd argue, boils down to how Jar Jar is a much more active participant in the story as opposed to just being comic relief. He has his own motivations as a character beyond just following everyone else around. He's competent enough to actually be of help to Mace Windu, and he plays a key role in deciphering the mystery of the disappearances on Bar-Dota. The other characters and setting of the arc also play a major role in Jar Jar's rehabilitation. First off, pairing Jar Jar up with Mace Windu was a fantastic choice on the part of the writers. It's such a hilarious, incongruous matchup, and yet it works really well for the plot because Windu's a great foil for Jar Jar. Windu's got a dark and brooding personality, he's serious and level-headed, and he's a devastating fighter. Jar Jar is the complete opposite of that, and pairing him up with Windu really helps accentuate his character because of how much the two are at odds. It also allows the viewers to see the value in Jar Jar's character traits. He's part of the story in the first place because he has attributes that Windu doesn't, and he puts them to use throughout the arc. Then there's Queen Julia. Introducing a love interest for Jar Jar was a hilarious yet gutsy writing move that the Clone Wars team are legends for making reality. That's right folks, between Mace Windu and Jar Jar Binks, Windu's the only one that's never gotten laid. Go figure. Julia was ultimately more of a plot point than a character, but she played a fairly important role in fixing Jar Jar's character. She legitimized him. She and the rest of the Bar-Dotans honor Jar Jar but give Windu the cold shoulder, building up Jar Jar as someone worthy of respect. We may find Jar Jar to be silly, but apparently this entire planet's worth of people doesn't, and their queen is madly in love with him. The unspoken message in this is that there's more to Jar Jar than we'd previously given him credit for. Lastly, the setting and plot themselves help to build Jar Jar's character in this arc. In the prequels, he was a bit of a fish out of water, or frog rather. He stood out in the plot like a sore thumb, but the Disappeared builds a story that was pretty much made around his character, and it helps him fit in a lot more. Both episodes are like an acid trip, with mystic settings, spooky cults, and all sorts of stuff that's ripped from Indiana Jones. And we're not joking about that last part. The design of the Bardotan throne room and the whole sequence in the Fangorol Temple are references to locations from Kingdom of the Crystal Skull and Temple of Doom respectively, while the end of the script for the second episode is, and we quote, "They ride off at the end of the last crusade." Jar Jar's still a bit out of place for Star Wars, but so is literally everything else in this arc, and so it works out well. But there's one major change they made to Jar Jar in this episode that really fixes his character, a much more subtle alteration that you might have not even noticed. Jar Jar isn't comic relief in The Disappeared, rather, he's written to be much closer to the classic literary trope of the fool. Here's a quick bit of context for those of you who either didn't study Shakespeare or, even worse, didn't pay attention to Shakespeare in school. You know who you are. The Fool, also occasionally known as the Joker or the Jester, is a common character archetype that usually isn't taken seriously by the other characters, but has much more insight into the world and story than they do. In Shakespeare's plays and a bunch of other well-known stories, these characters are often quite literally fools, court jesters serving kings or other aristocrats. This is usually because these kinds of characters are the only ones that can really speak the truth about what's going on, because they can sugarcoat it with humor to avoid angering their masters. In tragedies, they usually see how things are going to end up before anyone else, but aren't taken seriously enough for calamity to be prevented, while in more lighthearted stories, they can play unexpectedly important roles in resolving conflict. Jar Jar isn't quite on that level, but The Disappeared brings his character in that direction. His wackiness belies genuine intelligence, which this arc makes much more clear than any other Star Wars story. He has crucial insights due to his familiarity with the Bardotan people, and without him, Mace probably wouldn't have been able to solve the mystery and stop Mother Talzin. Windu doesn't take Jar Jar seriously at first, but he learns to trust his insight more over the course of the arc, understanding that, for all his foolishness, Jar Jar really does know a thing or two. And while Jar Jar doesn't totally fit the bill for being the fool, since he doesn't have to nest his insights into humor or anything like that, the message he's supposed to give the audience in this arc is ultimately the same. Even the most ridiculous of people can have a bit of wisdom to offer. So that's our look back at The Disappeared Part 1 and 2. But what do you think of this arc? Does the knowledge that Jar Jar had a girlfriend keep you up at night? Let us know all that and more in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.